3 years after my son died, my husband left me for my daughter-in-law. They thought they were so clever, until I played to the judge the recording of them planning my son's accident while he was still alive. If you're watching this, subscribe and let me know where you're watching from. Let me backtrack and tell you how a 64-year-old from Ohio became the woman sitting in a courthouse with evidence that would destroy 2 people I once loved. It started with grief, the kind that makes you do crazy things like reorganizing your dead son's bedroom for the 1,000th time. Michael had been gone 3 years, but I still couldn't bring myself to pack away his things. Maybe that's why I was up in his old room that March afternoon when I heard them downstairs. My husband Robert's laugh echoed through the house, followed by Sarah's breathy giggle. My daughter-in-law had been coming by more often lately, always with little Emma in tow, always with some excuse about needing help with something. I thought she was just lonely, still grieving Michael. How naive I was. "She's getting suspicious." Sarah's voice drifted up the stairs, clearer now that they'd moved to the kitchen directly below Michael's room. I froze. Michael's old baseball trophy halfway to the box I'd been packing and unpacking for months. Suspicious about what? "Margaret doesn't suspect anything." Robert's voice was confident, dismissive. "She's too wrapped up in her grief to notice what's happening right under her nose." My hands started shaking. I set the trophy down carefully, afraid the slightest sound would give me away. Whatever this conversation was, I needed to hear it. "It's been over a year since we started this." "Robert, when are we going to tell her?" "Tell me what?" My heart hammered so hard I was sure they could hear it downstairs. "Soon, baby. But we need to be smart about this. Margaret has money, and I'm going to need my half of everything when we divorce." The word divorce hit me like a physical blow. I gripped the edge of Michael's desk, my legs suddenly weak. Robert wanted a divorce? For Sarah, my dead son's wife? But then Sarah said something that made the blood freeze in my veins. "I just wish we didn't have to wait so long after what happened to Michael." There was a pause, and when Robert spoke again, his voice was softer, more careful. "We agreed we'd wait 3 years. It's only been 3 years exactly. Any sooner would have looked suspicious." Suspicious. That word again. Why would their relationship look suspicious? Michael had died in a car accident. What did that have to do with... I know. But I still can't believe it worked. When you suggested the brake lines, I thought you were crazy. The world tilted sideways. I grabbed onto Michael's desk chair to keep from falling. Brake lines. They were talking about brake lines. "It was the perfect plan," Robert continued, and I could hear the pride in his voice. "Everyone knows Michael was always working on that old Mustang. One little cut in just the right place, and..." I clapped my hand over my mouth to keep from screaming. They were talking about Michael's death like it was planned, like they had planned it. "Sometimes I wonder if he knew." Sarah's voice was dreamy now, almost wistful. "In those last few seconds before the crash, do you think he realized what was happening? Does it matter?" Robert's tone was cold, practical. "He's gone. Emma thinks her daddy died in an accident, and now we can finally be together. Everything worked out exactly like we planned." I must have made a sound then, because the conversation stopped abruptly. Footsteps moved across the kitchen floor, and I heard the back door open and close. Sarah was leaving, probably taking Emma with her. I sat down heavily in Michael's old desk chair, staring at the walls covered with his high school achievements. My son, my beautiful, kind, hard-working son, who'd loved that old Mustang more than life itself, who'd spent every weekend tinkering with it in the garage, talking to Robert about carburetors and engine compression. Robert, who knew exactly which brake line to cut. Sarah, who'd been sleeping with my husband while married to my son. Both of them, who'd murdered Michael and then waited 3 years to start their new life together. And me, who'd grieved for 3 years while living with his killer. That's when I realized the conversation I'd just heard was about to become their biggest mistake. Because what they didn't know was that I'd been recording everything in this house since the break-ins last summer. You see, after some teenagers broke into our house twice last summer, I'd had a security system installed. The kind with cameras and audio recording in every room, activated by motion and voice. The company had explained that it would capture everything for insurance purposes. Robert had complained about the cost, but he'd been traveling so much for work that I'd insisted. For my peace of mind, I'd told him. If only I'd known what kind of peace of mind it would actually give me. Now, Sitting in Michael's room, I realized that every conversation between Robert and Sarah for the past 8 months was stored on that system, including the one I'd just heard. My hands trembled as I made my way downstairs to the control panel in the closet. The security company had shown me how to access the recordings, though I'd never needed to before. It took me 3 tries to remember the password, Michael's birthday. The files were all there, organized by date and room. I scrolled back to March 15th, just 20 minutes ago. Kitchen audio file, 3:47 p.m. I clicked play with shaking fingers. Their voices filled the small closet space, crystal clear and undeniably incriminating. Every word about the break lines, about waiting 3 years, about Michael's final moments. I listened to the whole thing twice, tears streaming down my face. But I didn't stop there. If they'd been planning this for over a year, there had to be more. I found the first recording of them together on August 3rd, 2024, just 2 months after Robert started working late more often. Sarah's voice was excited, breathless. He suspected something, Robert. Yesterday he asked me why I was always coming over here when he was at work. Michael's not stupid, Robert had replied, but he loves you. That makes him blind to what he doesn't want to see. I fast-forwarded through dozens of recordings. Love talk, planning secret meetings, discussions about Michael's life insurance policy worth $500,000. And then, on January 18th, 2025, I found the conversation that made my blood run cold. "We can't keep this up forever," Sarah had said. "What if he finds out? What if he divorces me? I'll lose everything." "He won't divorce you." "Michael's not like that. He'd try to work it out, go to counseling, fight for his marriage." Robert's voice was thoughtful, calculating. Unless what? Unless he wasn't around to fight for it. The silence stretched so long I thought the recording had stopped. Then Sarah spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "Are you suggesting what I think you're suggesting?" "I'm suggesting that accidents happen, Sarah, especially to people who spend a lot of time working under cars. My son. They were planning to murder my son, and they were discussing it like they were deciding what to have for dinner." I sat in that closet for 2 hours, documenting every relevant conversation. The recordings painted a picture of a year-long affair that had escalated into murder when they realized Michael was starting to get suspicious. The worst part wasn't even the betrayal or the murder plot. It was hearing how little they cared about the pain they were causing. In one recording from February, Sarah actually laughed while describing how she'd cried at Michael's funeral. "I should get an Academy Award," she'd said. Robert had chuckled. "You were very convincing. Even Margaret hugged you and said how glad she was that Michael had found someone who loved him so much." I remembered that moment, standing in the cemetery, holding Sarah as she sobbed, thinking how lucky Michael had been to have a wife who loved him that deeply. I'd even told her she was like the daughter I'd never had. By 6 o'clock, I had compiled over 3 hours of recordings spanning from August 2024 to that afternoon. Enough evidence to prove premeditated murder and conspiracy. Enough to destroy them both. But I didn't call the police. Not yet. Because first I wanted them to know that I knew. I wanted to see their faces when they realized their perfect plan was about to become their perfect downfall. And I wanted to do it in a way that would make them suffer the way Michael had suffered. The way I had suffered. The way they were about to suffer. But here's what they didn't know about me. I hadn't spent 40 years married to an insurance investigator without learning a few things about evidence and patience. For the next 2 weeks, I became an actress worthy of Broadway. I continued my daily routine exactly as before. Morning coffee, afternoon gardening, evening news with Robert. I made dinner every night, asked about his day, even helped Sarah with Emma when she called. The only difference was that now I was recording everything intentionally, baiting them into more conversations. I'd mention how much I missed Michael, how I wished I knew what had really happened that night. Sarah would comfort me with her lies, and Robert would pat my shoulder while talking about accepting what we can't change. Every sympathy gesture felt like another nail in their coffins. During those 2 weeks, I also did my homework. I called my nephew Danny, who's a criminal defense attorney in Columbus. Told him I was thinking about updating my will and wanted to understand some legal concepts about evidence and recordings. "Aunt Margaret," he'd said, "recording conversations in your own home is perfectly legal in Ohio as long as one party consents. And since you live there, you're always a consenting party." Perfect. I also researched the original police report from Michael's accident. The investigating officer had noted that the brake failure was consistent with normal wear and tear on a vehicle of that age. No further investigation had been deemed necessary. Of course not. Who would suspect that a loving stepfather and grieving widow had conspired to murder their son and husband? But the most interesting thing I discovered was about the life insurance policy. Sarah had claimed it 6 months after Michael's death, which was normal. What wasn't normal was that she'd used part of the money to pay off debts that I'd never known Michael had. Debts that, according to my investigation, had been Robert's gambling debts transferred into Michael's name somehow. The web of deception was even deeper than I'd thought. On March 30th, exactly 2 weeks after I'd overheard their conversation, I decided it was time to spring my trap. I invited them both over for Sunday dinner, something I'd been doing less frequently since Robert started working late so often. Sarah arrived first with Emma, who immediately ran to hug my legs. My granddaughter was the one truly innocent person in this whole mess, and my heart broke thinking about what she was going to go through when the truth came out. "Grandma Margaret, can we make cookies?" Emma asked, her eyes bright with excitement. "Of course, sweetheart," I said, kissing the top of her head. "But first, why don't you go play in the living room while Mommy and I talk?" Sarah settled at the kitchen table, looking more relaxed than I'd seen her in months. "You know, Margaret, I've been thinking, it might be time for Robert and me to start spending more time together openly. As friends, of course, supporting each other through grief." The audacity of this woman. She was actually starting to lay the groundwork for their public relationship while sitting in the house where she'd planned my son's murder. "That sounds lovely, dear," I said, putting the kettle on for tea. "Grief can be so isolating. It's good to have someone who understands what you're going through." "Exactly." Sarah's smile was bright, genuine seeming. "Robert's been such a comfort to me. Sometimes I think Michael would be happy knowing we're taking care of each other." I turned away so she couldn't see my expression. Michael would be happy? The son she'd murdered would be happy that his widow was sleeping with his stepfather? Robert arrived just as I was serving tea. He kissed my cheek like always, asked about my week like always, played with Emma like always. The perfect picture of a grieving stepfather and grandfather. We had pot roast with all the fixings. Emma chattered about kindergarten and her friend's birthday party. Sarah talked about her job at the real estate office. Robert discussed a case he was working on. Just a normal family dinner. Except that I was sitting across from my son's murderers. After Emma went to watch cartoons in the living room, I brought out dessert, Michael's favorite chocolate cake. "I thought it would be nice to honor his memory," I said. Sarah's eyes filled with crocodile tears. "That's so sweet, Margaret. He would have loved this." "Yes," I agreed, taking a bite of cake. "I think he would have, just like he would have loved knowing the truth about what happened to him." The atmosphere shifted subtly. Robert's fork paused halfway to his mouth. Sarah's smile became just a bit more strained. "What do you mean?" Robert asked carefully. I stood up and walked to the kitchen counter, where I'd placed a small digital recorder. With deliberate slowness, I pressed play. Their own voices filled the room. "When you suggested the brake lines, I thought you were crazy. It was the perfect plan. One little cut in just the right place, and—" Sarah went white as fresh snow. Robert's face hardened into something cold and dangerous. "Turn it off," he said quietly. Instead, I let it play for another 30 seconds, until we reached the part about Michael's final moments. Then I clicked stop. 23 recordings, I said conversationally, sitting back down. Spanning almost 8 months. Every detail of your affair, your planning, and your execution of my son's murder. The silence stretched between us like a live wire. You should have seen their faces. Sarah looked like she was about to vomit, and Robert looked like he was calculating how quickly he could get to me and destroy that recorder. "Margaret," he said slowly, his voice taking on that reasonable tone he used when he was trying to convince someone of something they didn't want to believe. "I think you've misunderstood what you heard." I almost laughed. Even caught red-handed, he was still trying to manipulate me. "Have I?" I picked up the recorder and held it like it was the most precious thing in the world, which, in that moment, it was. "So when Sarah said, when you suggested the brake lines, I thought you were crazy. She was talking about what exactly?" Sarah finally found her voice. Margaret, please, just listen. Oh, I have been listening, dear. For 8 months, apparently. Did you know that when you two were planning my son's murder in my kitchen, I was upstairs going through his things? Trying to decide what to keep and what to give away because my grief was so overwhelming I could barely function? The color drained from Sarah's face even more, if that was possible. You want to know the really sick part? I continued, surprised by how steady my voice sounded. I actually felt sorry for you. Sarah, I thought you were struggling with being a single mother. I babysat Emma. I helped you with your car payments. I brought you casseroles. Margaret, Robert started. I'm not finished. The steel in my voice stopped him cold. I held you while you cried at my son's funeral, Sarah. I told you that you were like the daughter I never had. I watched you comfort Emma when she asked where Daddy went, and I thought what a wonderful mother you were, helping her through such tragedy. Sarah started crying then, but these weren't the crocodile tears from earlier. These were tears of fear. And you, I turned to Robert, you sat with me on countless nights when I couldn't sleep. When the grief was eating me alive, you held me while I cried and told me that Michael wouldn't want me to blame myself for not seeing the signs that something was wrong with his car. Robert's jaw tightened. You don't understand the whole situation. Don't I? I stood up and walked to the window, looking out at the garage where Michael used to work on his Mustang, where Robert had sabotaged it. What I understand is that my son started getting suspicious about his wife's frequent visits to his stepfather. What I understand is that instead of ending the affair, you two decided murder was the better option. It wasn't supposed to happen like that, Sarah whispered. I spun around. Oh, so there was a better way to murder my son? Please, enlighten me. We never meant for anyone to get hurt, she continued, the words tumbling out. We fell in love, and Michael would never have understood. So you killed him. The words hung in the air like an executioner's blade. It was an accident. Sarah's voice rose to near hysteria. We just wanted him to have a little accident, something that would put him in the hospital for a while, give us time to figure things out. A little accident? I stared at her in disbelief. You cut his brake lines, Sarah, on a mountain road. What did you think was going to happen? Robert stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. This conversation is over. You can't prove anything. I smiled then, probably the first genuine smile I'd had in 3 years. Can't I? I've already made copies, Robert, multiple copies, and my nephew Danny, you remember Danny, the criminal defense attorney? He's reviewed everything, very thoroughly. The room went dead silent, except for the sound of Emma's cartoons in the living room. What do you want? Robert's voice was flat, defeated. What do I want? I set the recorder down carefully on the table. I want my son back. I want the last 3 years of grief and guilt and agony back. I want to undo the moment I held Sarah at Michael's funeral and told her she was family. I paused, letting that sink in. Since I can't have any of that, I'll settle for justice. Margaret, please, Sarah begged. Think about Emma. Think about what this will do to her. That was the wrong thing to say. The absolute wrong thing to say. You should have thought about Emma before you murdered her father. My voice could have frozen fire. You should have thought about how she would grow up without him, how she would ask questions about Daddy that you would have to lie about for the rest of her life. I picked up my phone and started dialing. Who are you calling? Robert demanded. Detective Morrison. I believe he handled Michael's case originally. I think he'll be very interested in some new evidence that's come to light. Robert lunged for my phone, but I was faster than he expected. For a 64-year-old woman, grief and rage make excellent motivators. Don't, I said, holding the phone out of his reach. Emma is 10 feet away in the living room. Do you really want her to see her grandfather assault her grandmother? The look in his eyes told me that yes, he probably did want exactly that. But he stopped moving toward me. I finished dialing and waited for the detective to answer. When he did, I said the words I'd been rehearsing for 2 weeks. Detective Morrison, this is Margaret Foster. I have new evidence regarding my son Michael's death. Evidence that proves he was murdered. The silence in my kitchen was deafening. But from the living room, I could hear Emma laughing at her cartoons, blissfully unaware that her world was about to change forever, just like mine had 3 years ago. Detective Morrison arrived 30 minutes later with another officer and a technician to collect the recordings. I'd sent Emma home with Sarah before they arrived. The child didn't need to see her mother and step-grandfather being questioned about her father's murder. Sarah had barely been able to speak as she gathered Emma's things. "Margaret, please, I'm begging you. There has to be another way." "There was," I'd replied. "It was called not murdering my son." Robert, on the other hand, had shifted into full damage control mode. "You'll never be able to prove intent," he'd told me as we waited for the police. "Conversations can be taken out of context. A good lawyer will tear this apart." "We'll see," was all I said. Now, watching Detective Morrison listen to the recordings with increasingly dark expressions, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Hope. "Mrs. Foster," he said after hearing just the first recording, "I need to ask you some questions about these audio files. When were they made? Have they been altered in any way? How long have you had access to this evidence?" I answered everything honestly. The recordings were made by a security system installed after break-ins. They were completely unaltered. I'd discovered them 2 weeks ago and had been gathering evidence since then. "Why didn't you call us immediately when you found the first recording?" the other officer asked. I looked him straight in the eye, because I wanted to make sure I had enough evidence to convict them. One conversation could be explained away. 23 conversations detailing everything from the planning to the execution to their discussions of my son's final moments. That's harder to dismiss. Detective Morrison was making notes rapidly. "We're going to need to examine your security system, interview you formally, and begin the process of bringing charges. This is now a murder investigation. Murder investigation. 3 years late, but finally, my son was going to get justice." Over the next week, my house became a crime scene for the second time. The first time had been when Michael died, with detectives asking routine questions about his state of mind and recent behavior. This time, they were treating it like what it actually was, a homicide. The recordings were authenticated by forensic experts. The audio technician confirmed they hadn't been altered or tampered with. A voice recognition specialist verified that the voices belonged to Robert and Sarah. Most importantly, a mechanic examined what was left of Michael's Mustang, which had been stored at the impound lot all this time. Under closer scrutiny, he found evidence of deliberate tampering with the brake lines, cuts too clean and precisely placed to be the result of normal wear. "The original investigation was routine," Detective Morrison explained during one of our meetings. "Single vehicle accident, no witnesses, no signs of foul play. The brake failure looked consistent with a 15-year-old car that was frequently worked on. No one had any reason to suspect murder. But now you do. Now we have enough evidence to prosecute for first-degree murder and conspiracy. Your recordings establish premeditation, motive, and method. The physical evidence from the car supports the recorded confessions. Sarah was arrested first, at her office, in front of all her co-workers. I heard later that she collapsed and had to be carried out. Robert was taken from his office the same afternoon. The news hit our small town like a bomb. The local paper ran the story on the front page. Local woman's murder investigation reopened after widow discovers evidence. Within days, reporters were calling me, wanting interviews about how I'd uncovered the truth. I declined them all. This wasn't about fame or attention. This was about Michael. But the phone calls I did take were from friends and neighbors expressing shock and support. My sister drove up from Kentucky just to sit with me. My church circle brought enough casseroles to feed an army. The most difficult call came from Sarah's mother, Linda. "Margaret," she said, her voice broken. "I don't know what to say. I can't believe Sarah would... I knew she was unhappy in her marriage, but I never thought..." "Neither did I told her honestly. "If I had suspected anything, I would have warned Michael." "What's going to happen to Emma?" she asked, and I could hear her crying. That was the question that kept me awake at night. Emma was 5 years old. Her father was dead, murdered by her mother and step-grandfather. Her mother was facing life in prison. Her grandmother, me, was the one who had provided the evidence to convict her. What kind of life was that little girl going to have? "I don't know," I admitted. "But I know Michael would want her taken care of, protected, loved." "Sarah's going to say you're doing this for revenge," Linda warned. "That you never liked her and you're using this to hurt her." I was quiet for a long moment. "Maybe there is some revenge in it," I said finally. "I'm not going to pretend I don't want them to pay for what they did. But mostly, Linda, I just want the truth to come out. Michael deserves that much. 3 weeks after the arrests, I was sitting in my kitchen, the same kitchen where I'd overheard their confessions, when my lawyer called. "Margaret, there's been a development. Sarah's attorney wants to meet. She's considering a plea bargain." "What kind of bargain?" "Testifying against Robert in exchange for a reduced sentence. Admitting her role, but claiming Robert manipulated her, that the murder was his idea and she was coerced into going along with it." I wasn't surprised. Sarah had always been good at playing the victim. What does that mean for the case? It means we're almost guaranteed convictions for both of them. The question is whether you're comfortable with Sarah potentially serving 25 years instead of life without parole. I looked around my kitchen. At the table where Michael used to do his homework. At the counter where he'd made pancakes for Emma when they visited. At the window that looked out on the garage where he'd spent so many happy hours working on that damn Mustang. 25 years. Sarah would be 53 when she got out. She would have a life after prison. Michael would still be dead, but Emma would have a chance to know her mother again someday. And maybe, just maybe, that little girl deserved that chance. "Tell them I'll consider it," I said, "but I want to hear exactly what she's willing to admit to first. Because some justice was better than no justice." And I was finally starting to understand that this case wasn't just about punishing Robert and Sarah. It was about making sure Emma grew up knowing the truth about her father, knowing that he was loved, knowing that someone fought for him, even if it took 3 years. The plea bargain meeting took place in the district attorney's office on a gray October morning, exactly 3 years to the day after Michael died. I'm not sure if the timing was coincidental or if someone had a sense of poetic justice. Sarah walked in wearing an orange jumpsuit and handcuffs, looking nothing like the confident real estate agent who used to sit at my kitchen table. Prison had aged her. Her hair was unwashed, her face pale and drawn. When she saw me, she started crying immediately. "Margaret, I'm so sorry. I know you'll never forgive me, but I need you to know how sorry I am." I said nothing. I was there to listen, not to offer absolution. Her lawyer, a sharp-dressed woman in her 40s, spread papers across the table. "Mrs. Foster, my client is prepared to make a full confession in exchange for a sentence of 25 years with possibility of parole. She will testify against Mr. Foster and provide details about the planning and execution of the crime." The district attorney, James Chen, nodded. "Sarah, I need you to tell Mrs. Foster exactly what you're admitting to, in your own words." Sarah looked at me with red-rimmed eyes. "I had an affair with Robert starting in July 2024. Michael was getting suspicious, asking questions about why I was always at your house, why I was so secretive about my phone. Robert and I talked about ending it, but we were in love." Her voice broke on the word love, and I felt bile rise in my throat. Love. She was calling the thing that killed my son love. "Continue," Mr. Chen prompted. "In January, Robert suggested that if Michael wasn't around, we could be together openly. At first, I thought he was just talking. But then he started researching Michael's routines, his car maintenance schedule. He knew Michael always worked on the Mustang alone in the garage." "What specifically did Robert propose?" the DA asked. Sarah closed her eyes. "He said brake lines were easy to access and cut. That if we did it right before Michael drove to his monthly poker game in Canton, that mountain road with all the curves, it would look like an accident." I gripped the arms of my chair. They had planned it down to the specific road where my son would die. "Did you agree to this plan?" "I didn't want to," Sarah whispered. "But Robert said Michael would never give me a divorce, that he'd fight for custody of Emma, that I'd lose everything. He made it sound like it was the only way." "But you did agree?" "Yes." The word was barely audible. "What was your specific role in Michael's murder?" Sarah was sobbing now. "I was supposed to keep Michael distracted while Robert worked on the car. The night before his poker game, I picked a fight with him about money, accused him of spending too much on car parts. While we were arguing in the house, Robert went to the garage. You knew he was sabotaging the car at that moment?" "Yes." I closed my eyes, remembering that night. Michael had called me, upset about the fight with Sarah. "Mom, she's being so unreasonable," he'd said. "I don't understand where this is coming from." I told him to give her some space, that couples fight sometimes. I told my son to be patient with the woman who was planning his murder. After it happened," Sarah continued, Robert coached me on how to act, how to grieve properly, what to say to the police, to you, to Emma. You rehearsed your grief? Mr. Chen asked. Robert said I had to be convincing, or people would get suspicious. He made me practice crying, practice talking about Michael in the past tense, practice being a widow. The room was silent, except for the sound of Sarah's crying and my own heartbeat thundering in my ears. There's something else, Sarah's lawyer said. Something that wasn't on the recordings. I looked up sharply. Tell her, the lawyer prompted. Sarah raised her head, and for the first time since she'd entered the room, she looked directly at me. Robert wanted to wait longer before being together publicly, but I was getting impatient. That afternoon when you heard us talking, when I said you were getting suspicious, I had just told Robert that if we didn't make our relationship official soon, I was going to tell you everything myself. You were going to confess? I was going to tell you that Robert and I had fallen in love after Michael died, that we'd found comfort in each other during our grief. I was going to make it sound like it started after the funeral. But Robert didn't want that. He said it was too risky, that you might ask too many questions. He wanted to wait the full 3 years, then divorce you and marry me. Make it look like a natural progression. I stared at her. So, the conversation I overheard, Robert was trying to convince me to wait. He brought up the brake lines to remind me why we had to be careful, why we couldn't rush things. The irony was staggering. If Sarah had been more patient, if she hadn't pushed Robert to speed up their timeline, I might never have discovered the truth. Michael would still be dead, but his killers would be free. Mrs. Foster, Mr. Chen said gently, do you have any questions for Sarah before we proceed? I had 1,000 questions. I wanted to know how she could look Emma in the eye every day, knowing what she'd done. I wanted to know if she thought about Michael in those final moments before the crash. I wanted to know how she'd managed to stand at his graveside and throw dirt on his coffin while planning a future with his killer. But there was only one question that really mattered. Do you think 25 years is enough? I asked. Sarah's face crumpled. Nothing will ever be enough. I know that. I know I destroyed Emma's life, your life, my own life. I know I killed a good man who loved me and trusted me. 25 years, 50 years, life in prison. None of it will bring Michael back. She was right. Nothing would bring Michael back. But Emma would be 30 when Sarah got out of prison. She would have a chance to decide for herself whether to have a relationship with her mother. And maybe by then, Sarah would have become someone worthy of that relationship. I'll accept the plea, I said. Relief flooded Sarah's face, followed immediately by guilt for feeling relief. Thank you, she whispered. I stood up to leave, then turned back one more time. Sarah, Emma is going to grow up knowing what you did. Someday, she'll want answers. When that day comes, I hope you'll be ready to tell her the truth, all of it. She deserves to know who her father really was, and who you really were. I will, Sarah promised. I'll tell her everything. I walked out of that office knowing that my son's killers would be held accountable. Robert would likely face life in prison without parole. Sarah would serve 25 years. It wasn't perfect justice. Perfect justice would be Michael, walking through my door again, calling me Mom, bringing Emma for Sunday dinner. But it was justice nonetheless. And for the first time in 3 years, I could imagine a future where the weight of grief didn't crush me every morning when I woke up. The truth was finally going to set us all free. Robert's trial began 3 months later. In January 2026, Sarah had already been sentenced and was serving her time at the Ohio Reformatory for Women. The local courthouse buzzed with reporters and curious townspeople who couldn't believe that quiet Margaret Foster had uncovered a murder conspiracy in her own kitchen. I sat in the front row every single day, wearing a different outfit each time, but always with Michael's high school ring on a chain around my neck. Robert's defense attorney, a slick man from Cleveland named Marcus Webb, kept glancing at me like I was a bomb that might explode at any moment. He wasn't wrong. Ladies and gentlemen of the jury, Webb began his opening statement. You're going to hear recordings that will shock and disturb you. But I want you to remember that words taken out of context can paint a very different picture than reality. Out of context. I almost laughed. How exactly do you take, when you suggested the brake lines, I thought you were crazy, out of context? My client, Robert Foster, is a 67-year-old insurance investigator with 40 years of clean record. A man who loved his stepson, who grieved his death, who supported his widow through the darkest period of her life. The prosecutor, James Chen, stood for his opening. The defendant didn't support Mrs. Foster through grief. He caused that grief. He orchestrated it. And then he lived with her for 3 years, watching her suffer every day for the son he murdered. Over the next week, they played my recordings for the jury. Every conversation, every detail, every callous laugh. I watched the jurors' faces as they heard Robert and Sarah discussing Michael's final moments like they were reviewing a movie they'd enjoyed. The defense's strategy became clear quickly. Blame everything on Sarah. According to Webb, Robert had been seduced by a manipulative younger woman who convinced him to help with her plan to murder her husband. Sarah Mitchell was facing a divorce that would leave her with nothing, Webb argued. She needed Michael Foster dead, and she used her affair with Robert Foster to manipulate him into helping her. It was clever, I'll give him that. Paint Robert as the real victim, an older man led astray by a scheming woman. But they hadn't counted on how thorough I'd been. On the witness stand, I was ready for every attack Webb threw at me. Yes, I had hated Sarah for years. I hated her more each day since discovering the truth. Yes, I wanted revenge. I wanted justice for my murdered son. Yes, I had waited 2 weeks before calling police, because I wanted enough evidence to convict them both. Mrs. Foster, Webb said during cross-examination, isn't it true that you've never liked your daughter-in-law? That's correct, I answered calmly. I never liked her. Turns out my instincts were better than I thought. Several jurors smiled. Webb looked annoyed. You recorded these conversations secretly, without their knowledge? I recorded conversations in my own home, using a legally installed security system. Every conversation was captured automatically. You admit you wanted revenge against Sarah Mitchell? I looked him straight in the eye. Mr. Webb, if someone murdered your child, wouldn't you want justice? Objection, Your Honor. Non-responsive. Judge Harrison nodded. The witness will answer the question as asked. Yes, I said simply. I wanted the people who killed my son to pay for what they did. I still do. Webb tried a different approach. Mrs. Foster, these recordings span 8 months. Why didn't you suspect something sooner? That was the question that haunted me. Because I trusted them, I said. I trusted my husband of 40 years. I trusted the woman I thought was grieving her husband. I never imagined that the 2 people I was comforting in their grief had actually caused mine. The courtroom was dead silent. Sometimes, Mr. Webb, when you love someone, you're blind to their capacity for evil. That was my mistake, but it wasn't my crime. When I stepped down from the witness stand, I caught Robert's eye for the first time since the trial began. He was staring at me with something between hatred and grudging respect. Good. He should respect the woman who brought him down. But the defense had one more card to play, and they were about to show it. The bombshell came during week 2 of the trial when Webb called Robert to testify in his own defense. I watched my husband of 40 years walk to the witness stand, and for a moment I saw the man I'd married instead of the monster who'd killed my son. Under direct examination, Robert painted a picture of himself as a man grieving his stepson, seeking comfort in an inappropriate relationship that spiraled out of control. I loved Michael, he said, his voice breaking convincingly. When he died, I was devastated. Sarah and we found solace in each other. It was wrong, but it wasn't planned. Tell us about the conversations Mrs. Foster recorded, Webb prompted. Robert turned to look at the jury. Sarah became obsessed with the idea that Michael had been murdered. She would call me constantly, theorizing about who might have wanted him dead, how it could have been done. The break-line conversations weren't about planning a murder. They were about Sarah's paranoid fantasies about how someone else might have killed her husband. I felt my blood pressure spike. The audacity of this man, turning Sarah's confession into evidence of her mental instability. You're saying Sarah Mitchell was delusional? Webb asked. I'm saying she was a grieving widow who couldn't accept that her husband's death was a random accident. And in my attempts to comfort her, I sometimes played along with her theories. It was masterful. Disgusting, but masterful. He was making it sound like he'd been humoring a crazy woman, not planning a murder with his lover. But then came cross-examination, and James Chen was ready. Mr. Foster, in one recording, you say, "It was the perfect plan. One little cut in just the right place." Were you humoring Sarah's delusions? Or were you taking credit for a successful murder? Robert's composure cracked slightly. I was trying to make her feel better about her theories. By taking credit for murdering your stepson? I was being sarcastic. Sarcastic? Chen let the word hang in the air. Mr. Foster, in another recording, Sarah says, "Sometimes I wonder if he knew, in those last few seconds before the crash, if he realized what was happening." And you respond, "Does it matter? He's gone, and now we can finally be together." Was that also sarcasm? The courtroom was so quiet, you could hear Robert breathing. That conversation was taken out of context. What context makes discussing your stepson's final moments of terror acceptable? Mr. Foster? Robert's lawyer objected, but the damage was done. The jury was staring at Robert with disgust. Chen continued methodically, playing recording after recording, asking Robert to explain each one as either sarcasm or delusion management. By the time he was finished, Robert's story sounded as ridiculous as it actually was. But the real blow came when Chen called his final witness, Sarah Mitchell, via video link from prison. "Miss Mitchell," Chen began, "the defendant claims your conversations about brake lines were fantasies, delusions about how someone else might have killed your husband. Is that true?" Sarah, looking haggard in her prison uniform, shook her head. "No, Robert suggested cutting the brake lines. It was his idea. I recorded some of our conversations on my phone because I was scared, and I wanted proof in case something went wrong." The courtroom erupted. Sarah had her own recordings? Webb jumped to his feet. "Objection! This evidence wasn't disclosed!" Judge Harrison called for a recess while the lawyers argued. I sat in the hallway, mind reeling. Sarah had recorded their conversations too, and she'd never mentioned it during her plea negotiations. When court resumed, Chen played Sarah's recordings. They were even more damning than mine because they captured the actual planning conversations, not just the aftermath discussions. In one, recorded in February 2025, Robert's voice was crystal clear. "Michael's getting too suspicious. We need to act soon before he figures out what's going on." Sarah's voice responded, "How do we make it look like an accident? Leave that to me. I've investigated enough insurance fraud to know how these things work." In another, from March 2025, just days before Michael's death, "Are you sure about the brake lines? Trust me, baby, one cut in the right place and it'll look like normal wear and tear. The mountain curves will do the rest." I closed my eyes as the recordings played, hearing them plot my son's death with the same tone they might use to plan a vacation. When the recordings ended, the courtroom was silent except for the sound of someone crying. I looked around and realized it was me. It was. Robert's face was ashen. His brilliant defense strategy had just collapsed completely. But Chen wasn't finished. "Miss Mitchell, why didn't you disclose these recordings during your plea negotiations?" Sarah looked directly at the camera. "Because Margaret Foster deserved to be the one to bring them down. She lost her son. She deserved to be the hero of this story, not me. I only decided to come forward when I saw Robert trying to blame everything on me. Even from prison, facing 25 years, Sarah was still capable of surprising me. The trial was essentially over after that, but there was one more revelation waiting, and it was going to change everything I thought I knew about my son's death. The final witness was someone I hadn't expected, Detective Morrison, who had investigated Michael's original accident. Chen called him to testify about the physical evidence, but during cross-examination, Webb asked a question that opened a door no one saw coming. "Detective Morrison, during your original investigation, did you interview anyone who suggested Michael Foster's death might not have been accidental?" Morrison hesitated. "There was one person who seemed suspicious of the circumstances." My heart stopped. Who else had suspected something? "Could you elaborate?" "Michael Foster's employer, Dave Richardson, called our department about a week after the accident. He said Michael had mentioned being worried about someone tampering with his car." The courtroom buzzed with murmurs. Chen looked as surprised as everyone else. "Did you follow up on this report?" "We interviewed Mr. Richardson, but he couldn't provide any specifics. He said Michael had just seemed paranoid in the weeks before his death, checking his car obsessively, asking questions about automotive sabotage." I gripped the bench in front of me. Michael had known. Somehow, my son had sensed the danger. "Your Honor," Chen said, standing up, "I request a brief recess to investigate this new information." Judge Harrison granted the recess, and within an hour, Dave Richardson was on his way to the courthouse. I knew Dave. He'd been Michael's supervisor at the engineering firm for 8 years. Michael trusted him. When court resumed, Dave took the stand, looking nervous but determined. "Mr. Richardson," Chen began, "tell us about Michael Foster's behavior in the weeks before his death." Dave looked at me before answering. Michael was scared. He didn't say much, but he'd started checking his car every morning before driving to work. He asked me if I knew anything about automotive sabotage, said he'd been reading about brake line failures. Did he say why he was concerned? He said someone with access to his garage had been asking a lot of questions about his car maintenance routine. Someone who knew exactly when and where he worked on the Mustang. The pieces clicked into place with sickening clarity. Robert hadn't just known Michael's routine. He'd been asking about it, studying it, preparing for the murder. Did Michael suspect anyone specifically? Dave hesitated, glancing at Robert. He never said a name, but he mentioned being worried about his stepfather. Said Robert had been asking weird questions about the Mustang's brake system. Robert's face had gone white. His own behavior had made Michael suspicious. What kind of questions? Technical stuff about brake fluid, brake line placement, how often Michael checked them. Michael thought it was just curiosity at first, but when Robert kept asking, "When was the last time you spoke to Michael about this?" "The day before he died. He called me that afternoon. Said he was thinking about taking the car to a mechanic to have everything checked professionally. He was going to do it right after his poker game." The irony was devastating. Michael had been planning to have his car inspected the day after his murder. If he'd done it one day earlier, he might still be alive. Chen continued, "Did Michael mention any other concerns?" He said his wife had been acting strange, spending a lot of time at his mother's house, being secretive about phone calls. He was starting to wonder if she was having an affair. I closed my eyes. Michael had been putting the pieces together. The suspicious stepfather asking about his car. The unfaithful wife spending time with that same stepfather. He'd been so close to discovering the truth. "Mr. Richardson, in your opinion, was Michael Foster paranoid, or was he genuinely in danger?" Dave looked directly at Robert. He was in danger, and I think he knew it. When Dave finished testifying, the prosecution rested. Robert's defense was in shambles. The jury had heard overwhelming evidence of premeditated murder, including the victim's own growing awareness of the threat against him. During closing arguments, Chen painted a picture of a calculated killer who had not only murdered his stepson, but had been arrogant enough to study his victim's routines openly, causing Michael to become suspicious in his final weeks. Webb tried desperately to salvage something, arguing that Robert's questions about the car proved he was innocent. Why would a guilty man draw attention to himself? Because, Chen responded in his rebuttal, Robert Foster was so confident in his plan, so certain that no one would ever suspect him, that he didn't bother hiding his preparation. He thought he was clever enough to commit the perfect murder. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours. Guilty on all counts: first-degree murder, conspiracy, and tampering with evidence. As the verdict was read, Robert turned to look at me one final time. I stared back without flinching. This man had killed my son, lived in my house for 3 years while I grieved, and then tried to blame everything on his co-conspirator. But there was still one more revelation waiting, one that would finally give me the complete truth about why Michael had to die. And it would come from the most unexpected source: Emma. The sentencing hearing was scheduled for 3 weeks later, but before that could happen, I received a phone call that changed everything I thought I knew about this case. It was from Linda, Sarah's mother, who had been caring for Emma since Sarah's arrest. "Margaret," she said, her voice shaking, "I need to see you. Emma said something yesterday that I think you need to hear." We met at a small cafe outside town. Linda brought Emma, who ran to hug me like she always did. Despite everything, this little girl still saw me as Grandma Margaret, the woman who made cookies and read bedtime stories. "What's this about?" I asked after Emma had settled at a nearby table with coloring books. Linda's hands trembled as she spoke. Yesterday, Emma was playing house with her dolls. She was acting out a scene where the mommy and daddy dolls were fighting, and the mommy doll said something that made my blood run cold. What did she say? She made the mommy doll say, "Daddy knows about the baby. We have to tell Grandpa Robert before Daddy gets mad." I stared at Linda. "What baby?" That's what I asked her. And Emma said, very matter-of-factly, that Mommy had a baby in her tummy that wasn't Daddy's baby. It was Grandpa Robert's baby. The world tilted sideways. Sarah had been pregnant? I asked Emma more questions. Very carefully, Linda continued. She said Mommy went to the doctor for the baby, but then the baby went away. She said Mommy was very sad about the baby going away, and that's when she started spending more time with Grandpa Robert. My mind raced through the timeline. Sarah and Robert's affair had started in July 2024. Michael died in October 2025. If Sarah had been pregnant and had a miscarriage or abortion. Linda, when do you think this happened? Based on what Emma remembers, I think Sarah got pregnant in late 2024, probably around Christmas time. The pregnancy would have ended sometime in early 2025, January 2025. The same month, the recording showed Robert and Sarah first discussing murder as an option. Emma said something else, Linda continued, lowering her voice. She said Daddy was asking Mommy about doctor visits, about why she was sick in the mornings. She said Daddy was getting grumpy about Mommy's secrets. Michael had been suspicious about more than just an affair. He'd been questioning Sarah about a pregnancy that couldn't possibly be his, because the timeline didn't match. I called James Chen immediately. "A pregnancy changes everything," he said, after I explained what Emma had revealed. If Michael was questioning Sarah about a pregnancy that wasn't his, and if Robert was the father, it gives them an even stronger motive for murder, I finished. Exactly. Michael wasn't just a suspicious husband anymore. He was on the verge of discovering that his wife was pregnant with his stepfather's child. Chen petitioned the court to reopen the case to present new evidence. Judge Harrison, clearly disturbed by these developments, agreed to hear testimony from Linda and a child psychologist who had interviewed Emma. The psychologist, Dr. Rebecca Walsh, testified that Emma's statements were consistent and detailed, showing no signs of coaching or false memory. Children Emma's age, she explained, typically don't fabricate complex stories about pregnancy and medical procedures. In my professional opinion, Dr. Walsh said, Emma is recounting genuine memories of conversations and events she witnessed in her household. Linda testified about Emma's doll play and the specific statements she'd made about the pregnancy and her parents' fights. But the bombshell came when Chen called Sarah back to testify via video link. "Miss Mitchell," he said, "were you pregnant during your affair with Robert Foster?" Sarah was silent for a long moment, tears streaming down her face. "Yes." "Was Robert Foster the father?" "Yes." "Did Michael discover this pregnancy?" Sarah nodded, unable to speak. "Miss Mitchell, you need to answer aloud for the record." "Yes," she whispered. "Michael found my pregnancy test. He confronted me about the dates, said the timing didn't match our intimacy. He knew the baby wasn't his. What happened to the pregnancy? I had a miscarriage at 12 weeks. But by then, Michael was asking too many questions. He said he was going to demand a paternity test, that he was going to find out who the father was. The final piece of the puzzle clicked into place. Michael hadn't just been suspicious about an affair. He'd had concrete evidence of Sarah's infidelity and was determined to uncover the truth. "Miss Mitchell, is this why you and Robert decided Michael had to die?" Sarah looked directly into the camera, her face destroyed by grief and guilt. "We couldn't let him find out about Robert being the father. Robert said if Michael knew, he'd destroy both our lives. The murder was never about the affair. It was about covering up the pregnancy." The courtroom was silent except for the sound of my own heartbeat. They hadn't just killed Michael to be together. They'd killed him to hide the evidence of their betrayal. Judge Harrison called for a recess, but I barely heard him. I was thinking about my son in his final weeks, discovering his wife's pregnancy, realizing it couldn't be his child, determined to uncover the truth that would have revealed his stepfather's ultimate betrayal. Michael had died not just because he was suspicious, but because he was smart enough to figure out exactly what had happened. And that's when I realized the full scope of what Robert and Sarah had taken from us. They hadn't just murdered my son. They'd murdered my grandchild, too. The sentencing hearing became something entirely different after Sarah's revelation about the pregnancy. Judge Harrison called it one of the most depraved cases of family betrayal he'd seen in 30 years on the bench. Robert received life in prison without the possibility of parole. But before the judge pronounced sentence, he allowed victim impact statements. I had spent weeks preparing what I wanted to say, but when I stood at that podium, looking at Robert in his orange jumpsuit, I set my prepared remarks aside. Your Honor, 3 years ago, I lost my son in what I believed was a tragic accident. I grieved not just for Michael, but for the grandson or granddaughter I would never have, because he and Sarah were trying to have another baby. I paused, looking directly at Robert. What I didn't know was that Sarah was pregnant, with Robert's child. My son died trying to protect a family that included a baby that was actually his stepfather's. The courtroom was absolutely silent. Robert didn't just murder my son. He murdered his own unborn child to cover up his crime. He forced Sarah to choose between her lover and her husband, and when she chose him, he made sure that choice would cost Michael his life. I turned back to the judge. Your Honor, this wasn't a crime of passion or a moment of poor judgment. This was a calculated execution of a young father who was asking the right questions and getting too close to the truth. When I finished, Robert's lawyer waived his client's right to speak. What could he possibly say? Judge Harrison's sentencing speech was scathing. Mr. Foster, you have committed what I consider to be the ultimate betrayal. You murdered a young man who trusted you, who called you family, who had no idea that the man he looked up to was systematically destroying his life. After the sentencing, I walked out of that courthouse feeling something I hadn't experienced in 3 years. Peace. Not happiness. I would never be happy about Michael's death, but peace that justice had finally been served. 6 months later, I received a letter from Sarah in prison. She wrote about her therapy sessions, about finally understanding the magnitude of what she'd done, about wanting to be a better person for Emma when she was eventually released. I didn't respond to that letter, or to any of the others that followed. But I did something else. I started the Michael Foster Foundation, dedicated to helping children who've lost parents to domestic violence. Because while Emma wasn't technically a victim of domestic violence, she was a child whose father was murdered by family members, and she deserved support. Emma comes to visit me every month. Linda brings her, and we bake cookies and read books and talk about her daddy. I've told her age-appropriate versions of the truth, that some bad people hurt her daddy, and now those people are in jail where they can't hurt anyone else. Someday, when she's older, Emma will want to know more, and when that day comes, I'll tell her everything. I'll tell her that her father was a good man who loved her, who was trying to protect their family when he died. I'll tell her that he was smart and brave, and that he figured out the truth because he loved her enough to ask the hard questions. On Michael's birthday this year, Emma and I released balloons in his favorite colors. As we watched them disappear into the sky, Emma asked me if Daddy could see them from heaven. I think he can, sweetheart, I told her. And I think he knows that we made sure the bad people got punished. Good, she said with 5-year-old certainty. Daddy deserved justice. Yes, he did. And after 3 years of grief, lies, and betrayal, he finally got it. People ask me if I'm angry, if I'm bitter, if I regret turning in the people who were once my family. The answer is complicated. I'm heartbroken that my son is gone. I'm devastated that Emma will grow up without her father. I'm angry that I spent 3 years comforting the people who caused my pain. But I'm not bitter, because Michael raised that little girl to believe in justice, in truth, in standing up for what's right. And that's exactly what we did. Sometimes the people who hurt you most are the ones closest to you. Sometimes the people you trust most are the ones plotting against you. Sometimes the only way to protect the innocent is to destroy the guilty, even when it costs you everything you thought you had. Michael's recording equipment is still installed in my house, not because I'm paranoid, but because it reminds me every day that truth has a way of revealing itself, no matter how carefully people try to hide it. And sometimes, if you're patient enough and strong enough and willing to lose everything to find the truth, justice isn't just possible, it's inevitable. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe and feel free to share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.